I will be joined by a very special guest tonight for this episode of Coast to Coast Pinball, which, if you're keeping count at home, will be number 158. So let's go. Welcome to Coast Pinball. My name is Nate Shivers. This is a podcast, a commentary. I'm a man out of quarters. Thank you for joining us tonight. Coming to you not live from beautiful San Diego, California, here on Tax Day, Wednesday, April 15th, 2015, 4/15/15, if you will. Tonight, joining me for a feature interview will be Mr. Greg Dunlop. He has been in and around pinball for over 20-some years. He's worked at Williams, worked with Pat Lawler Designs and Stern, deep into the competitive pinball scene. You might have seen him on some of the Papa TV coverage, or the Indus coverage, or recently the coverage from Las Vegas, streaming on the Indus channel. He's a great guy, lots of insight, some fun stories. I look forward to this interview very much. So without further ado, Mr. Greg Dunlop. I would like to welcome to Coast Pinball tonight, Mr. Greg Dunlop. How are you, sir?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm great. Greg, thanks for coming on tonight. You're one of those guys who's sort of kind of been all around pinball, been a little bit everywhere. I've always known your name. I've always known stories about you. I don't know that we've met in person unless it was just in passing.
I don't think we have.
I think I've been, near you at some point, because I know exactly what you look like. I've seen you on different streams of tournaments doing commentary. But anyway, welcome to Coast to Coast Pinball. Thanks for coming on tonight. I think we'll have fun.
Sure.
Fun. So I guess what we should do, for those that don't know who you are, or maybe haven't heard other interviews you've done before, is kind of just sum up your involvement in pinball over the years, and we'll kind of go through some different things, where you've been for what. And I guess if I was going to sum it up, I would say you're a longtime competitive pinball player, very active in the community, a former Williams employee, which I think is definitely of note, and I think there'll be lots of good stuff to talk about. So where did you start in pinball, and where are you now in pinball, I guess, is what I'm looking for.
So I started getting into pinball around 93 or so. A friend of mine and I went to drive to Indiana to see a band play that she was going to interview for a magazine.
Who was the band?
It's a well, if anybody can cite this band, I'll be impressed. But it was a noise band from New Zealand called Belter Space.
Ooh, very obscure.
Yeah. There will be one person listening to this who's really excited, and everybody else will be really confused. So we drove to Indiana, and we got there early, and I had kind of started playing pinball a little bit, just kind of at the bar across the street from where I worked or whatever. And she had been getting casually into it at school, and so we were like there, and we got there a couple hours early, and we're like, maybe we can find a place to play pinball here. And there was a laundromat in the strip mall across the street from the club. And so we went in there, and this laundromat had like 40 games in it. And so we stood there playing, and she's like, "Oh, you should play this game, Twilight Zone. I just played it the other day. Really good." And so I went over and I played it, and it blew my mind. Like, this game was so good. And that really was the moment where like pinball became a real thing for me. And there was a group of us in Chicago, because back in the day, before the internet was really a big thing, we used to be able to play the games when they were on test, and nobody knew anything about them because the manufacturers were much more secretive back then than they are now, where news really drifts out a lot. Williams never let that stuff leak. And so a game would go on test, and then we would go and play it, and we would report back to the then what was a pretty small community of Rec Games Pinball. And so, we would haunt the test sites, and one of the Williams test sites was right across the street from where I worked. It was an arcade called Times Square. And so one day I was there playing World Cup soccer, and a guy came in, and he was like, "Oh, can I get into the machine for a second?" And he pulled out a computer and hooked it up to the machine, and he was obviously downloading stuff. And so I started talking to him, and he said, "Oh, hi, my name's Larry." And it turned out it was Larry DeMar. And,
oh, wow.
And he and I started talking, and it turned out that he had worked, and then that was when he revealed that he had worked on Twilight Zone, and then I started freaking and flipping out. He also worked on Black Knight, which is another favorite of mine. And so that was really exciting. And later I met Matt Coriel, who was the other programmer for World Cup Soccer, and he encouraged me to go to IFPA 4, which was the big pinball tournament that was happening that weekend. And I was like, I don't know, I'm not very good, a tournament, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, you should go. And so I went, and it was a gigantic double elimination tournament, and I went 3 and out. I won one, lost one. I lost one, won one, lost one, and I was done. But at that tournament, I met a lot of people who are really my best friends in the whole world right now. I met Keith Johnson, I met Bowen, I met Brian Dominy, I met Louis Koziars, Don Coons, Lyman, Dave Heggie, all these people, Jason Wardrick, all of these people who are still around in the pinball community today. And that was really my first, when I started getting into competing. And then I joined the Chicago League, and then I met more and more people at the manufacturers. And it was through those connections that I eventually got a job at Williams. It was Ted Estes who got me hired. And he was like, this was around the time when Monster Bash was being developed. And he said that, things aren't so good in the pinball industry right now, but there's like kind of a, group of pinball people who are hiding out in the slot machine division waiting to get a job back in pinball again. And if you want to join us, then you can do that. And so I did that, and we worked together for a long time, and it was actually really fun. And I found the slot machine stuff really fascinating, and then Pinball 2000 was going on. And so I was around for all that, which was completely fascinating and amazing to be around. And then, of course, the shutdown happened, and that was horribly depressing. And then so I kind of went into a startup world for a little bit and wasn't enjoying it too much. And at a Williams, we used to have these Williams get-together lunches, and then at one of them I was talking to Pat, and by that time, Pat Lawler Design had become a public thing, and they were getting started on their first game. And they were talking, and Lewis was talking about how they didn't really have enough time to code. And so through that, I got a job with Pat, and that was when I did my actual pinball industry work. I was writing code for Monopoly, Roller Coaster Tycoon, Ripley's Believe It or Not, and NASCAR. And so, and that was really fun and interesting, but it was also really tough because Pat's, where Pat was having his office was way out in the Chicago suburbs, and I lived in the city. And so for a while I worked remotely kind of, and then when I moved to Seattle, it was just becoming unwieldy, and so that ended, and that was kind of like I kind of took a break from pinball at that point, and kind of was on other things. I moved to Sweden for a while. I was living there for about a year and a half, and I played a little bit there. They've got a really active pinball community there, and all the players are really good. But it wasn't really until I moved back to the U.S. and back to Portland that I kind of dove headfirst back into pinball again. There's a really amazing pinball community here, and so and I've started competing more and playing more and made great friends, and I'm traveling more again, and that's basically the path that I have taken.
It's great. I love it because it touches on a lot of things. When I hear you tell that story, one of the first things I can't help but think of is you guys in Chicago, in the Chicagoland area, back in the early 90s, sort of, you were the original insiders in a lot of ways. You were out finding the games before they were released and getting to kind of pull the curtain back a little bit. And do you remember finding any of those, classic games for the first time before anybody else had ever seen them?
I mean, I remember, the core group was kind of me and Lewis and Don Coons, and they kind of called us the Beta Boys on RGP because we were the ones who were scouring the beta locations and reporting back to them. And I mean, I definitely remember, playing Roadshow for the first time. I famously slagged Roadshow on RGP after I first played it, which Pat and Ted held over my head for the rest of my life, semi-jokingly. But the first time I met Ted, he definitely told me how upset they were about it when it happened. But I remember, I played Star Trek Next Generation for the first time. I remember, playing Theater of Magic and Corvette and Johnny Mnemonic and all of those games, around that era. Jackpot, I remember playing incessantly, a game I really love to this day. And it was really exciting, you know. You walk up and you don't know anything. Everything's completely fresh. There's no reports. There's, you know, nothing
You didn't even
new.
know what the theme was going to be. You literally
No,
just
not
walked
at
up
all.
to some brand new machine.
Yep. You walk into League one day, and there's Larry and Lewis rolling in Jackpot.
We will likely never have that experience ever again in the history of the Earth.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I know that Bowen talks a lot about how there's so much more transparency into rules and things now. But I think in a lot of ways we've kind of lost that process of discovery for ourselves. You know, it's kind of an interesting trade-off. You know, we really won't have that experience that we used to have at Pinball Expo, for instance, where, you know, the tournament at Pinball Expo used to be, here's 15 of the latest games and the top 16 high scores get into qualify, and nobody's seen this game before at all. And you know, that doesn't, I mean, it happens for people who live in places where they don't get games very much, but even they can go on Pinside and watch videos and all of this kind of stuff.
You referenced RGP, and it's been such an interesting thing to watch over the past few years as the rec.games.pinball community really dwindled, and it's still there, but it's certainly not anything like it was, and we've seen the rise of Pinside, and now sort of leading the witness down the road. And one of the reasons I thought it was a great time to have you on is your website you've started is tiltforums.com. What was the move from RGP to more of the Pinside world like, and what kind of caused that for many people listening probably, you know, weren't a part of that group, but what was it like in the beginning, and what did it kind of become at RGP?
I mean, when I think about RGP back in the beginning and the core group of people, a lot of whom are still around today, you know, especially on the manufacturer's side, like Lewis and Keith Johnson and Lyman and Kevin Martin and a bunch of other people kind of got their jobs in the pinball industry through RGP, because the pinball community, the Venn diagram of people who are into pinball but also were technically savvy enough to get on the internet in 1993 was a pretty small,
just a few people crossed into both those areas. Yeah.
And so but everybody there was really into it, and, you know, at the time, because collecting hadn't really become as big a thing back then, some of us owned games, but it wasn't the way that it is now. It was a lot about playing. It was a lot about what are the rules. It's about how do you play things. It's about, you know, what games are you seeing. It's about, you know, there was some stuff about fixing and maintaining games, and a lot of bitching about how, you know, games were broken on location and all of that kind of thing. But it was really about, like, what's new, what's happening in the world of pinball from a player's perspective and from the people who enjoy playing the game. And I think as time went on, a lot of that started getting a lot more taken over by the collector community, was sort of the way I saw it. And a lot more discussion was getting on about horse trading in games and you know, collecting games and fixing games and stuff like that. And it's like, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's a great topic to have, but it's not anything that was really interesting to me. And then around the time of the shutdown of Williams, there was a lot of discussion, some of it not particularly enjoyable to read, about sort of the way that Williams died and about, you know, they deserved to die, and, you know, and all of this kind of stuff. There was a lot of real, you know,
a lot of negativity.
Around it. A lot of, you know, flame war kind of stuff happening. And it was just like, at that point when I was just like, this just isn't anything I want to read anymore. I mean, you know, when Williams died, when pinball closed, that was a really, like, personally and profoundly affecting thing that happened to me personally, because, you know, that was like watching my dream die.
Yeah, you were there. You found the job in this cool industry, and then you watched it be eliminated. Right,
and even so, it was still the best job I ever had or ever will have, probably. And so, you know, to read that stuff was just not vibing with me. And so that was sort of when I kind of drifted away from RGP. And, you know, my drifting away from a lot of pinball, I mean, I played a lot still locally, and I played in the league locally, but I would say that a lot of my drifting away from pinball kind of happened around that same time too. I mean, I obviously went to work for Pat, you know, a lot of other stuff was still happening, but I just wasn't as centered in the group as I was back then. And so I actually kind of missed out on the rise of Pinside in a lot of ways. Most of my interaction with pinball was through going to events, or talking on there are various ways in which all of us who grew up in the 90s have connected with each other, and email lists and chat rooms and whatnot. And so a lot of my connection to pinball came through those channels, and just all of us who were friends and stuff like that. And it wasn't even really until 2 or 3 years ago that I really became aware of Pinside as this giant phenomenon in the place where everybody was collecting to have pinball in the first place.
Yeah. Do you own games personally nowadays?
I had one game which I ended up donating to Pop this year. It was a Royal Flush. In the past, I've had as many as 9. When I moved to Sweden, I kind of liquidated. My plan had been to move to Sweden and stay and not come back. So I had a home use only Attack from Mars, which is gone. Wow. I had gotten it from Lyman. I traded him a home use only High Speed 2 and some cash for it. And I had gotten the High Speed 2 from Brian Rudolph, who was a former Data East employee and had bought it new in box.
I think when you said home use only Attack, a lot of people, my skeptical friendly listeners, probably just went, yeah, sure. And then you said from Lyman, and they went, oh my gosh. They all sat up in their seats.
Yeah, he actually had 2, so he had a spare.
Oh, wow.
And then I sold it to Kaylee, and Kaylee sold it to another guy, Bariah, who lives in the Seattle area. So I had that. I had a really nice Twilight Zone that I sold to a friend of mine in Seattle. I had and still have. It's not here. It's at somebody else's house. A Phantom House, which is an interesting game. It was a kind of combination slot trail game similar to the Safecracker Top game that Williams made for the German market, but it was made by all of the pinball guys like Scott Slomiani and Bill Grupp and Linda Deal put it together. And that's a kind of fun little conversation piece.
I've never heard of that. I'm searching my head thinking, have I ever heard that story? I don't know if I know anything about that.
Yeah, it was actually a gambling machine, and it's probably illegal for me to own, and I shouldn't be talking about having it, but it doesn't have any coin mechs or anything in it. It only runs on free play. But it was really cool. The artwork is super cool. The theme is super fun. And it had actually a double light matrix, so it has all of these light shows that are really intense. And it's a really neat game. I brought it to Northwest Show one year, and then decided I was too scared to bring it out anymore. So,
yeah, absolutely.
But it's a really cool game. There's some stuff out there on the internet if you want to dig into it, and if you ever talk to if you ever have any of those guys on the show, they really like talking about it.
That's very cool. What was the move to Sweden like? What did you find? I guess, did you go from Chicago at the time to Sweden?
No, I went from Chicago to Seattle, and I lived in Seattle for a few years. And then me and the girl that I was with at the time moved to Sweden, and it was really fascinating. I mean, from a pinball perspective, there's not a lot of location pinball in Sweden. Much of where the pinball playing happens is from people who are collectors, and they get together and rent large spaces to store their games, and then they have open house nights or tournament nights where everybody goes and plays. Real estate is expensive in Europe, and sure. Everybody lives in very small apartments, and so having games at your actual house doesn't really work out. But a lot of these sort of hidden away warehouse spaces exist where people play. And I had already known some of the people in the Swedish scene when Helena Walter won B division at Papa. I was in B finals that year. The only time I've ever qualified in any division at Papa, despite many tries. I had known Mats Runston already. I used to at Papa every year on Saturday night. We would take a break at night, and I would bring my poker chips, and we would run a poker tournament for whoever wanted to play. And Jorian had won that poker tournament one year, and so I knew a lot of these guys from just from being around the pinball scene and stuff. And so I got to go and play with them quite a bit, and they're all really good.
they are. Some of them are number 1 in the world right now.
Oh yeah, that's right. They're all really good players, and so that was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to go to those places, but at the same time, I was also getting really involved in work and stuff, and I was doing a lot of traveling around Europe and back to the States actually for conferences and to speak at conferences and run these coding things. So I was really involved in this open source project, and so a lot of my time in Sweden, I didn't do a lot of socializing with people outside of the people in my work sphere. And I didn't spend a lot of time going, to pinball events. I mean, like when IFPA held their championship the year that Kaylee won, I didn't even go. I met Josh and Zach in Stockholm one day, and we got together and went out to play. But I mean, I was reasonably separated from the pinball community at that time, which I kind of regret a little bit now. But
Well, you came back and you wind up in Portland, Oregon, which I think there's a little bit of a friendly rivalry between Portland and Seattle, as maybe two of the top cities for location pinball in the country. What's Portland like nowadays? I know I had Noah on the show, and he kind of spoke to how great it is. What's Portland pinball like in your eyes?
It's really cool because, I mean, I believe that right now, if you believe the pinball map statistics, Portland has the largest number of games on location of anywhere else in the country. And so it's cool because, like, when I landed here, there were, 5 or 6 bars within walking distance that I could play, 3 or more games at. And when I got here, I remember going to my first tournament and everybody being very friendly. I was very, I had a lot of game knowledge. One of the interesting things about people who have gotten in pinball in the past several years is that there's a lot of games that, if you don't encounter them very often, they don't know how to play them. And they're games that, I played when they came out. Like for a while, I remember at Pinburg last year, for instance, we had Data East Frankenstein in a group. And that was a game that I had played a lot when it came out, and I played in tournaments a lot when it came out in Chicago. But everybody was just kind of scratching their heads about it because it's not a game you really see anywhere, right? Yeah. And so, I had a lot of game knowledge that people didn't have, and I was able to use that to open up a lot of conversations. And obviously, I've been around for a long time, playing for a long time. But everybody here is super friendly and easy to get along with. I've never met such an easygoing but still competitive pinball scene because, I'm used to like a group of people get together to play pinball and it's just, let's just play pinball and have fun and drink beer, or people get together and it's like super, super competitive and super serious. But the Portland scene really has a great like middle ground there. It's like everybody likes to get together and be social and casual, but everybody takes it really seriously too. And everybody here is pretty evenly matched. I mean, Noah and when he was here, Aaron Nelson aside, they were kind of a step above everybody. But beyond that, there's a group of like 10 or 15 players here who are all really super evenly matched and good. And that makes everything super competitive and super fun because, I mean, on the one hand, I always say that it's great to play with people who are better than you, which, when I was in Chicago and I started playing, I was playing with Wordrick and Heggie and Lyman. And I learned a ton from those guys, but I lost constantly.
Yeah.
And so
sometimes you got to learn how to win also.
Yeah, that's right. Right. And so it's nice here because, we all trade, titles back and forth. But also, there are people who will come up and, show up out of nowhere. And a year later, they're winning tournaments, I can think of 2 or 3 people who have been like that in Portland in the last year who just like showed up not knowing anything about pinball and then just kept playing and playing and got really good. And so I love that we have a scene that can welcome in people like that. And it's just, there's so many places to play. And I just really love the vibe of the pinball community here.
I was sort of listening to some old stuff and older audio stuff from you just to, get my facts straight on a lot of levels. And I noticed it's probably 6 or 7 years old, you claimed at the time you were ranked something like 396 in the world. And today you're 196. So as the player base in the IFP rankings has like exploded, you've seemingly climbed up. You play a lot of tournaments too. Do you feel like you've become a lot better player over the past few years?
I don't think there's any doubt that I'm playing better than I ever have in my entire life, and I completely lay that at the feet of the enormous pinball scene that we have here, because I'm playing more than I ever have in my entire life.
You guys have a lot of tournaments.
Oh yeah, I mean, we have every Tuesday we have a weekly tournament that rotates around bars in town. We also have probably about once a month we'll hold another event that's like on a weekend or bigger. So, for instance, this coming weekend we've got the Portland Pin Brawl, which is a gigantic 128 player.
It's a big one.
double elimination tournament. It's Papa Circuit event this year. It's been running for 7 or 8 years. We have one called the Cascadia Cup we run every year. We have one called the Gridiron Classic we run every year, which is kind of like a football schedule tournament kind of thing. That's a lot of fun. We have a Christmas charity toy drive tournament every year, and then and sometimes when the IFPA charity tournament months are happening, we'll always run stuff for that. So there's a lot of opportunities to play here, but on top of that, it's also cool because one of the things they have here, and I never really appreciated this before I moved here, is old games. C-Bar here operates old games and EMs, and a lot of the collectors here, like Mike Mahaffey and Noah, focus on like the classic Bally's or EMs, and a lot of people have these games around, and I never really appreciated EMs and old games the way that I do now, and they've really expanded my skill set as a player too, because the skills needed to play those games are completely different from what you need to play solid state games, and that whole process has been really, really interesting too. And then on top of that, the rise of like the streaming and the availability of tutorial videos and all of that, and paying attention to that stuff at a level that I never really had before has definitely upped my game quite a bit.
I've watched you do commentary. I think the last time I saw you was Las Vegas. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, for the Nationals.
What's that like? Because I've talked to a lot of the guys on the show about, how do we make pinball more exciting to watch? And I can watch hours and hours of the best players play these games over and over, but I don't know that the non, real pinball enthusiasts would get into that. What's it like doing sort of play-by-play or at least color commentating on, players playing pinball machines instead of you actually being a player there playing the machine?
It's a little, it's definitely taken me a little bit to get my feet wet under it. I remember when we did the first streaming broadcast ever at the Pinburg 3 years ago, I think it was now. It was me and Bowen and Eden Stam, and it was just like so kind of brought together ad hoc, and we didn't really know what we were doing, but it was also like, over time, we got lucky because that year we did the Poppet Circuit final, and that was the year that Daniele came up from 19th seed to win the whole thing. So we had a really good story to rally around, which is super important for making this stuff interesting. And over time, I know that for myself, I'm always trying to point out things that'll be interesting to players of all skill levels. So like every hour or two, or every time we start a new round, I'll try and recap the rules of a game somewhat. At the Nationals, Carl D'Angelo set up the streaming setup there, and he had that telestrator so that we could draw lines on the screen, and that was super helpful for when we need to talk about, like, oh, I expect him to do, ramp combos on Metallica, and that's when you go up this ramp here and then shoot up this shot here and draw the lines to follow the path. And I think that stuff is actually really helpful.
I love that. I think that's a huge, huge plus when you're trying to draw people in.
Oh, I totally agree. But when we talk about what we need to do to make the broadcast more accessible to the average player, I think Josh kind of stole my thunder on that, because I've been thinking for a long time that what we need to do is not make them live. We need to edit them, because when he talks about poker, and I really love poker, and I actually love watching raw broadcasts of poker. And one time I was in Vegas and they were having a WPT event there, and I just sat around for hours just watching Howard Lederer and Gus Hansen play. And I find that really fascinating, but I also understand that watching Howard Lederer fold hands for an hour is not everybody's idea of a good time.
Sure, right? I've done it too. I've played a lot of poker. I've sat in the ring watching, like, especially the oddball poker games, and I'll watch 7 people around a table where I can't see their cards, and I'm enthralled by it.
Oh, yeah, me too. I think it's fantastic.
But that would get no ratings on television.
No, not at all. And, I think the same thing has to happen to pinball, and it has to be, it's one of those things where, like, if you look at documentary filmmaking, they talk about coverage, right? They cover a lot of stuff in the hopes that a story will come together and that they'll have enough footage to put it together. And I think pinball needs to, at some level, be the same way, because it's like people want to see a story. Like when Daniele comes in, he's from Italy. He, shows up. I think it might have been it's the first time I remembered seeing him at Papa. And he comes in and he just starts winning and winning and winning, and he's knocking out player after player. He's knocking out the best players in the world. He's and he's moving up the line. And as time goes on, and he's playing hour after hour, and he keeps not losing. And as time goes on, it's like, all of us were totally rooting for him to put it together and win, and he does. And that's an amazing story, and it was amazing to be a part of it. And if you're going there and you're filming and you want to turn this into something later, you want to have those stories in hand. Sometimes the story of somebody who tries really hard and just misses is a really compelling story too. And somehow we need to figure out a way to make that happen. When you think about what that involves, it involves resources. It involves resources at a level even beyond what Pop-Up TV already is.
Sure.
And whether that'll ever happen or not, I'm not sure. Another way this can go, and I've talked to Josh a lot about this, is like when we talk about sort of the reality show path, right? But that's sort of a different path, and I think that becomes much less about competition and much more about personalities and about, these two guys are going to play a match and the winner's ejected kind of thing, And so that's fine, and it'll bring a lot of attention to it, but it's kind of a different thing. And it's just a thing that I'm less interested in,
Yeah, I agree. How has, I don't think there's a lot of people I'm going to have on the show that have played in, so many different tournaments and over the years and kind of seen the rise and the fall and the rise. How's competitive pinball since like the 90s when you were going to expos back then? Because I know you went to a ton of pinball expos. What's competition like nowadays versus then? How's the average player stack up? Obviously it's relative, but what's your take on that?
It's the average player is 100 times better now than they were back then. It's kind of mind-blowing how good the players are now compared to back then. And it's funny because I've actually gone back to those old tournaments. Like my first Papa was Papa 5 in New York. And I remember going and seeing, I remember Dirty Harry was there and Maverick was there and Shack Attack was there. And I remember seeing the scores that people were putting up. And I remember, recently I was going back and looking because I was like, that there's no doubt about the fact that the players now are better than they were back then. But I don't think the scores are that much higher. But one of the things I realized is that we're doing so much stuff now to make the players' lives harder in terms of like, when you go to Papa and you're playing Lord of the Rings and you've got that gigantic yellow post, blocking the right ramp so that you can't backhand it, right? Or, we're removing outlane posts and opening them up all the way and taking out the ball savers and all of this stuff that we never really did back then because people weren't playing Dirty Harry for an hour and a half back then. Elwyn was not walking up to a Dirty Harry and putting up 8 billion points while everyone sat around watching him back then. And I personally find a great fascination in watching, Elwyn or Yorian take apart a game. Like watching Yorian take apart Star Trek at Pinball Expo last year was totally like out of this world to watch. But on the other hand, I also understand how an average person watching him sit there and loop warp ramps all day in timeout modes is not exactly the most exciting thing in the world.
I actually was pretty enthralled by the commentary of how annoyed people were at watching him timeout. They've killed Star Trek. Star Trek is dead. I thought that was very interesting. That's interesting to hear. What do you think of the games being built now? Like when you talk about a Star Trek, you talk about a Walking Dead. I think Stern's doing a great job at Variety. What do you? What's your take on these games that we're seeing now versus the games that were coming out, late 90s, mid 90s, and how they sort of hold up against each other? And then as far as competition go, do you think there's any thought being put into these games for competitive play?
There's no doubt that games from a rules standpoint are way more intense now than they were back then. You think about AC/DC is pretty much the operating example of this. This is a game whose rules are still, years after it's been released, being analyzed and picked apart and talked about in terms of different strategies and ways you can play it. This is a game for which I don't know if there will ever be just like the one strategy that everybody plays all the time, because there's so many different ways to attack it. And I think that's amazing. And it's an amazing game. But on the other hand, I know that for me personally, like I don't have the skills to play that game at the level that like a Josh or a Zach or an Elwin do. I just can't, you know.
Yeah.
I flounder constantly on that game, and most of the reason that I flounder is because I'm trying to set up gigantic scores and failing. Because on that game, if you don't set up a gigantic score, you're getting nothing. And that's and so for me, it's like while I appreciate that as like, you know, kind of one of the pinnacles of pinball strategy in the modern era, it's not a game I have a lot of fun with, to be honest. When I look at modern games that I really like a lot, I actually really love Metallica right now. One of the things that I really like about it is that it's not a game that you're constantly feeding the flipper back to. You know, as I said, one of the things that I've really come to appreciate is older games. And one of the things about older games is you're constantly fighting the ball. And Metallica does a really, really good job of rewarding you for taking risky shots and fighting the ball. And I find that really fun. You know, when I think about Star Trek, it's a little bit like I'm just a little bit over kind of flow games at this point. You know,
yeah.
It's like I think Star Trek is a fun game, and you know, me in the '90s would probably think Star Trek was the best thing in the world. It's just like kind of, you know, ramp loop side ramp loop. You know, kind of, you know, it's just like I'd rather have something that was a little more kinetic and interesting. You know. And from a rule standpoint, while I wasn't blown away by Metallica at the beginning, I think it's really grown to be something that's really amazing. And, you know, I think the addition of Crank It Up is something that really exploded a new dimension in that game. And I think it's super fun.
I agree. You know, I bought a Metallica that literally landed here yesterday. So I unboxed it yesterday. I've been playing it. And I sold a game tonight. And the guy that came over, he looked at it and he said, yeah, I liked this, but... And he said exactly the opposite of what you just said. He said, it doesn't have any flow. I never get the ball back on a flipper. I like my AC/DC and my Tron, is what he said to me.
It's funny because it's like, you know, I would have felt the same way back in the 90s. But on the other hand, it's like, I don't know. It's like, and I'm just sure it comes from my new appreciation of older games, that I like games like that I like games that you're fighting.
That's a great connection. That's a great connection. I agree. I totally agree with you. I love it. I have been loving that game because I feel like I'm constantly nudging and shaking and twisting and trying to get that ball to go where I want it to. That's good commentary. I like that. I mean, how important do you think it is having Lyman Sheets? And I know you know Lyman, but having him there sort of being the heartbeat of the programming at Stern today, as a top-level player, someone who's played a lot of competitive pinball, having that guy is the brain of where these games need to go. I mean, can you speak to how important Lyman is to modern-day pinball rules?
Other than Keith Johnson, I think he's the only one really thinking about modern day pinball rules and trying to do things with modern day pinball rules. You know, really thinking in terms of balance, risk reward. You know, that's one of the amazing things about both Metallica and AC/DC is that aspect of risk reward and how long. You know, but with Crank It Up or with Song Jackpots on AC/DC, it's like, how long are you willing to kind of bring yourself to the edge? You know, oh, 40 million, should I collect it? Oh, 50 million, should I collect it? Oh, but I've got the 2X lit, you know. I mean, I have lost more than my share of Crank It Up jackpots on Metallica because I tried to go after the 2X, right?
Yeah.
And I think that dimension is something that Lyman's really brought into the modern age and really, you know, and has used it to expand the strategic aspects of pinball. We played a tournament here where I set Crank It Up to the lowest possible number of items that you can use to start it, which I had hoped would be 1. I wanted the game to be just like Crank It Up
just ready
all
to
day
go.
long.
Yeah.
But it was 5. You couldn't go lower than 5.
That's still quick.
Oh, yeah. And it happened, and I mean, it was so much fun because it was like no matter how far behind you got, there was always this lingering possibility that you could have 100 million Crank It Up. Right. And I think that made it really exciting because people always felt like they were in it, you know. So from that, and you know, those are the kinds of innovations that a guy like Lyman with so much experience and so much thought, and also who's still really plugged into the competitive world and seeing how people are playing and seeing what they're doing and seeing what can you do to challenge these people more, but to still make games that are fun for everybody, because I think both Metallica and AC/DC have been incredibly popular. So, I mean, I think he's an extremely innovative and forward-thinking person. And, I mean, he's really, when we look at it, he's like, it's like, a lot of what has happened, and I don't know how much people realize this, but a lot of what has happened about those games and them getting updated over time, it's just him, like, spending his nights and weekends doing AC/DC updates or doing Metallica updates, because, my understanding, I haven't been, plugged in at Stern for quite some time, but my understanding is that, once games get to a certain point that, like, they need to move on to the next game, and that's the reality of life at Stern. And so a lot of the reasons that those updates over the last several years even exist is just because Lyman wants to make those games as good as they possibly can. And, even now when he sees, the Highway to Hell kind of exploits on AC/DC, he releases a code update to address them, and I think that's something that's really, it's amazing that he has that kind of dedication, but it's also kind of a bummer that that's the way that it has to happen,
Well, and we've seen the frustration certainly pop out with the, the hashtag "Where's the Code" movement that's risen, because I haven't talked about this in the show yet, so I'll throw it out here right now, but I talked to Gary Stern at the Midwest Gaming Classic a few days ago, and I flat out asked him, I just said, so what percentage of games are being sold to home use in the United States? And he said in the U.S., he thinks it's near 70%. And I can't help but think that if that is going to be one of your major places to sell, you're going to be just begging for frustration if you have these really bare bones code, as people have already paid their $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 for a game.
I mean, you're right. There's no doubt about that. I think that one of the things that this stems from is that people don't have a real understanding of how the business works.
Yeah.
And, because one of the things about the pinball business is that at its core, it's a manufacturing business. That's what it is. It's about manufacturing an industrial appliance, basically. And in a manufacturing business, if you're not producing games, if you're not producing what you make, then you're not selling things, and then you're losing money. And at Williams, it was worse because they had a unionized workforce, and so in the factory, if they had to stop the line for any reason, they were still paying everybody on the line every single day, union wages. And so, keeping the line running was always the mantra. You've got to keep making games. Gary has a little more flexibility than that because he doesn't have a unionized workforce. But on the other hand, there is definitely a cost to stopping the line and restarting it. You lose people, they come back in because they're temp workers, right? So you're going to lose some have to come back in. You've got to get the line moving. If you're switching games, there's a cost associated with that as you get tooled up for a new game and stuff like that. And the reality is that in order to keep the line moving, you have to be making games. And in order to keep making games, you're limited in the amount of time that you have to actually make them, and that time is limited by how many games you're producing. Back in the day, Williams had 4 full teams of people who were making games, and they were making 15 or 20,000 of each game. So they could take a year and a half to make a single title. That's not like that now. We're making, I don't know what the modern numbers are, but I'm guessing they're around 3,000 to 4,000 of each game.
That sounds about like what I've heard whispered around, yeah.
And when you're making 3,000 to 4,000 of each game, and you're working with a staff that's at least half of what Williams had on hand, the reality is that you only have 4 to 6 months to get a game done. It's probably, from a code perspective, right? They get handed a whitewood, and this is the amount of time they have to get a game done. And then they have as long as that game is on the line, and then they've got to move on to the next one. Because probably pretty close to everybody is working on every game. Now, I know they've hired some new programmers in the last year or two, and have actually been it's been really interesting hearing from them as they come into the community. And it's actually been really cool to see new blood come into the community for the first time in a really long time. Because most of the people working in the pinball industry right now are the same people who have been working in the pinball industry since the 90s, I mean, like Ray Tanzer at Stern. was it Gottlieb back in the Premiere days, and you've got George, and you've got Lyman, and you've got Lonnie, and you've got Ted and Keith, and the designers are all the same: Steve Ritchie, John Borg, Joe Balser, Pat. All of these people, these names have been around forever. And when I see like new guys like that guy Jack at Stern, who's a new programmer, and he's talking about his thought processes behind the Star Trek code, that's really refreshing and stuff. So adding some of those people allows them to spread that out a bit. But the reality is that if they want to keep making games, if they want to keep the line running, there's only so much time that they have. It's just like the facts of the business. And so, while on the one hand I understand the frustration of the people who get games without code, on the other hand, a lot of me is thinking, would you rather see a game would you rather see no games? Because this is the reality, again, we can make games like this or we cannot make games. And B, I see people like Lyman who are spending so much of their own time and energy getting these games to that point, and then I see people applying pressure to get more out of it, and I'm like, this is not like the way that things should be going.
The current model just doesn't support the old school way of doing it, I think, is what we're kind of seeing. And it's interesting watching it play out, because I see both sides completely, and I think there's a happy medium maybe, and I think Stern's been trying to address that, like you said, hiring new people as business has picked up, because business has picked up.
And, I mean, the reality is that even compared to like 2 or 3 years ago, Stern is doing way, way better than they were. There was a period in there where it was looking, I was, for like 3 years in a row, I was saying, oh my God, this is it. There's no way Stern's going to live another year, they've managed to hold on. And that's kudos to Gary, who's a really he's a businessman. He really is a businessman, and he does understand these economic issues. There's definite forces at play there that I think a lot of the people who push for the code updates don't really get or want to acknowledge. Or, I've brought this up on Facebook, for instance, and people are like, well, that's no excuse, or Gary shouldn't be so cheap and stuff like this. And I'm like, there's a complexity here that I don't think people want to wrap their head around.
Sure.
I'll say one other thing that really frustrates me about this whole thing, and that's like the same people who are on this where's the code bandwagon are also the same people who will like jump all over a brand new Cactus Canyon or an Adams or something. And when you look at those games are not deep. Adams has basically 2 ways to attack it. It's got one goal that almost anybody who's played pinball for like a year and a half can achieve, and it's got maybe 3 or 4 ancillary things that you can use to increase your score. You can go for multi-ball, or you can go for mansion tours. If you want to bring in millions ramps or 5x graveyards, you can do that. If you want to bring stars and bonus X into it, you can do that. And that's pretty much the whole game from a scoring standpoint. And it's like, I don't get these guys who like will like fall on their knees at the altar of Adams and then complain about the fact that Star Trek is not deep enough.
Well, I think they're holding everything to a different level, I guess, is what's happening.
Right, but I mean, it's like this is a game that, even at its earliest code, probably had a lot more to do in it than Adams ever will. Big Bang Bar is another game that really frustrates me in this way, because I think people get so wrapped up in this myth of Big Bang Bar, and it's like I remember playing Big Bang Bar when it came out and just like being like, well, this is definitely better than anything Capcom has done to this point, but I still don't think this game is very interesting. And I still don't think the game is very interesting. And I definitely think that people are holding, games are a lot more expensive now. And as you say, people are buying new in-box into the home a lot more than they did back in the Addams Family days. And, there's definitely a mythology around Williams that has sort of built up in the same way, in a different way than has been built up around Stern now and stuff like that. But I definitely think that, a lot of this stuff about like games should be deeper. I understand when games come out really rough and unfinished, and Metallica is a great example of a game that came out very, very rough and very, very unfinished.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's like when I see that differing standard in place, it kind of bugs me and rubs me the wrong way too.
Sure. What was working with Pat Lawler like? Because you're one of few people with that sort of unique experience to work sort of directly with him. What can you say about your time on the 4 games that you worked on with Pat?
Pat is an extremely talented playfield designer. One of the things I always loved about Pat's playfields is that he never stopped trying new things. And I think, there's sort of been this movement towards the fan layout in pinball that you hear talked about all the time. And Pat never went that direction. He was always trying to come up with different ways to change the geometry of his games or add a new weird shot here or mess around with stuff. He had that weird ramp shot that went behind the flippers on Roller Coaster Tycoon, and he had the little playfield on Monopoly, or on the little playfield on Family Guy, right, and stuff like that. And I always really loved that he was always doing that, and it was always fun to play his new playfields and stuff, and that stuff was always really cool. But me and Pat never saw really eye to eye on the rules standpoint and stuff like that, and so that made it a little frustrating for me when I was working with him. It's not to say that anybody was right or wrong. It's just that our sort of ideologies of how a game should play and what the priorities on a game are never really met eye to eye, and so that was it made the experience really interesting for me, but a little frustrating too, because a lot of what I wanted to bring into the games never really made it. I'll also say that one of the bummers after working at Williams for working for Pat had to do with the fact that we spent a lot of time at Pat's office out in Marengo, Illinois, at his house actually, and it was just sort of the four of us. It was me and Pat and Lewis and John Crutch, the mechanical engineer, who's kind of a legendary mechanical engineer who did all the stuff for Pat's games. And it was just like, after being at Williams, you get so much feedback on stuff at Williams. People are always coming in your office and playing your whitewood and giving you feedback and talking about things, and little things from everybody appear. And games get a lot of polish that way. And we were kind of like out in the countryside working on games by ourselves, and maybe once a month we would bring a whitewood into Stern and show it off. Or maybe, towards the end of a design cycle, we'd have an open house and a bunch of people would come in and play the game. But that I really missed that aspect of that community that we had on the floor at Williams, of everybody playing each other's games, of everybody talking to each other, of everybody getting excited about different things and stuff like that. And that part, it didn't have anything to do with Pat or any of that. It was, but it was just an aspect of working at PLD that was like, I don't think I even realized until much later how much that kind of affected me in the way that I thought about things.
Sure. We keep saying that you worked at Williams, you worked for Pat Lawler. Describe what you actually were doing. I know you worked on the coding side of things. What was your actual background there? And I know you were, I've read you're self-taught at this, but what did you do to, quote, work in pinball?
When I was at Williams, I worked on slot machines. So I wrote software is what I did. I worked on game software for several machines at Williams. Probably the biggest one was one of the very first Monopoly slot machines, which was me and Scott Slomiani and Bill Grupp and Larry. So that was like my first experience at Williams. And then later I got into an operating system group at Williams with me and Ted Estes and Bill Grupp. And then after shutdown, Lewis worked with us for a while and Cameron Silver worked with us for a while. It was always sort of this pod of pinball refugees hoping to make their way back in, which it never happened. There are a lot of interesting. I found that business really fascinating, and so that was really cool. Aside from the fact that the pinball side didn't work out,
wasn't doing well. Yeah.
Yeah, and then at Pat's, I was software again. Most of what I did for the games was on the display or choreography side. So I worked a lot doing dot matrix animations, lamp effects, coordination with sound effects and stuff like that. Especially when I was a remote worker, it was easier for me to work on that stuff because back in the old Stern system, the display was completely discrete. It was on a separate chip from the main game code, so it made it very easy for me to just take a back box for a game and walk away with it and work on it to specifications that me and Lewis would trade back and forth. I was actually noticing the other day that we had used some Yahoo groups for coordination back in the day between me and Lewis and Adam Ryan, who was doing the dot matrix animations, and that those still exist out there, which kind of made me laugh.
All right, sort of a loaded question, and you don't have to answer. if there happened to be another former Bally Williams designer out there in the ether right now, and maybe he was having trouble getting programming and design done for some new games that were not to market yet, would you be interested?
I've had those conversations at various times with various people over the years. I think I would probably not, unless the situation were very special. Again, you look at Jersey Jack, for instance, and it's that scattered situation again, right? Keith and Ted and Pat, even though they're all in the Chicago area, my understanding is that they all kind of mostly work from home and separated from each other. And then obviously Jack's on the out in Jersey, and everybody's kind of spread apart. And it's like, part of me thinks it would be fun to be back in the industry again, but part of me would want it to be as special as it was before. And that's not an environment in which I feel like it would be as special as it was before.
Sure.
But also, I'm here in Portland. I've established my life here. I'm 45 years old. Stability is something that's, job stability is something that's very important to me. I feel like my time at sort of taking a shot at my dream happened, and it didn't work out. And, that's a bummer. But, here we are. If there's one thing I have thought about doing, it's that, a lot of the games that I worked on that I wasn't necessarily that happy with, I've thought about going back and revisiting.
Such as?
Well, I actually think that Roller Coaster Tycoon is a game that, from a playfield perspective, had a lot of potential, but that I was never really a fan of the way that the rules came out for a variety of reasons. And when you look at what's available now in terms of the P-Rock systems and stuff like that, it would actually give me the opportunity to go and legally revisit a game like that and sort of make it, over in my image again. And I think that would be really interesting. One of the things that I love about Jackbot is that it took a playfield that I always hated in Pinbot, a game that I always hated to play, and made it fun. And that was one of the things that first got me thinking about what an important aspect that rules play in a game. And I've always thought it would be really interesting to have, two versions of this game, like Roller Coaster Tycoon, or like we see now with Bride of Pinbot or Demolition Man and stuff, and be able to compare and contrast the different ways in which the game's played just from changing the code. But it would also be an enormous undertaking, and one that every time I think about it, I think, oh my God, then I've got to go back, and also because I'm not working with any of the real source materials, so I got to redo the art and I've got to redo the music and blah blah blah. If it was just redoing the rules, I could see it being okay, but starting over from scratch, it just seems like a gigantic thing.
I'm fairly certain you'd be playing less pinball if that were to happen.
That is probably right, and it's just more fun for me to play and run tournaments and all of that kind of stuff now.
Speaking of running tournaments, you are going to be the tournament director for the main tournament at the California Extreme Show this July, correct? July 11th, 12th, somewhere in that range?
It's 2 or 3 weeks before Replay FX.
Yeah, I want to say 12th, 13th now that I'm thinking of it. What's the format going to be like at that tournament? That's a fairly large tournament as far as national tournaments go. What are you looking forward to for this California Extreme?
Changing it up a little bit this year. One of the things I actually semi-ran it last year with Bowen, and it came kind of together at the last minute, so I'm just trying to get a little more advanced work going on it to make sure that we have games together and volunteers and all of that kind of thing. I think the biggest thing we're changing this year is that we're eliminating the Classics division and instead making a big main division that contains games of all eras. We're shooting to have 12 games with 4 DMDs and 4 middle ear solid states and 4 EMs.
Very cool.
And it would be a Herb qualifying format in which you have to, I think I finally decided it would take your top 7 scores.
7 of 12.
Yeah, so in order to qualify, you will have to definitely get your feet wet outside of the area that you're expert at. So, someone who, like Andy Rosa, who has grown up and is expert at Stearns, will have to take their feet out of that. But someone like Bob Matthews, who's excellent at EMs, will also have to take their feet out of that as well, which I think is super great and super interesting and reflects, sort of my feeling that there's a lot of skill to these older games that's different than the skill on the modern games, and I would love to see people who are expert at handling all of those situations. From a logistical standpoint, it also clears us up from having to run 2 sets of finals on Sunday, which, when you look at shows that run late, is very often a source of conflict. And so that's, just from a logistical standpoint, that helps us out a lot.
That's the California Extreme at the Hyatt Regency Santa Clara, and that's actually July 18th and 19th. I found the dates. There we go.
Papa Circuit event.
Papa Circuit event, yeah. So
That's right.
That's going to be a good one for anybody on the western side of the country. So one thing I definitely wanted to talk about tonight is the website that can be found at tiltforums.com, which the first few times I went there did not realize was started by you. Where did Tilt Forums come from? What is the goal, and how has it gone since it launched, I believe, in January?
Yeah, basically, it stemmed from, like I said, I hadn't really been aware of the rise of Pinside other than, within the last 2 or 3 years. And one of the things that I saw there, and which really bothered me, and which sort of stemmed from a lot of conversations, because I'm involved in the technology community, and it's running through a lot of the same pains that the pinball community is in terms of just like how are women treated and how are minorities treated and stuff like that. And, one of the things that really stood out to me about Pinside is this kind of locker room mentality that goes on there. And it's just like, it's fine. And, if people want to have an environment like that, that's fine with me. I would never want to stop anyone from having an environment like that. But it wasn't for me, and a lot of people that I knew didn't feel very comfortable with it. And so, and I had been kind of bummed out about that for a while. And a lot of that bled over into discussions on Facebook, where a lot of pinball discussion is happening right now as well. And a lot of talks with people that I know in the community and stuff like that. And around December, Bowen posted a thing on Pinside, a thread about, let's talk about this. Let's talk about, the way that women are treated on Pinside, and, sort of threads like who's the hottest female pinball player, and, maybe making some kind of an area, especially for not safe for work items that are separated out from the rest of it. And the response that he got was just like there was a little bit of support, but mostly what he got was a very, very, very much less polite version of "get off my lawn."
Yeah, a lot of backlash. I remember that.
Yeah, and I was like, wow, this really sucks, because here's somebody who's like taking what I consider really valid concerns and bringing them up and trying to do so in a very honest and fair way, and just getting kicked in the pants over it. And it was around that time when I was just like, there had been for a while a semi-private mailing list of a lot of players out there, and I had been thinking that, and it sort of coincided with my thinking about this, that and what I was talking about with RGP, about how RGP was really for players, right? And it was really about talking about playing. And that seemed to be such a small part of what Pinside was all about. And I just wanted a place that was a little more focused on playing. And if people want to talk about collecting and fixing games, that's fine too. But I know what I wanted to talk about. What I wanted to talk about was playing and competing and rules and stuff like that. But I also wanted a place that was just a lot more welcoming and open, and where a lot of that like locker room mentality was really, really toned down. And so what I did was I got together a group of people who I approached. Bowen was one, Nicole, my girlfriend, was one, Eka Schneider, who runs the Bells and Chimes League in San Francisco, Zoe Vrabel, who's a woman who plays here in Portland, who's very good, Elizabeth Cromwell from Papa, Isaac Ruiz, who's another local player, Andreas Hochstrup, who's a player in San Francisco, who I respect a lot. And we all got to and Joe Schober, another longtime player from Virginia. He runs the FSPA, and he's been around for as long as I have, and I've known him forever. And we just sort of I got them together and started talking about what we thought a new pinball forum would look like. And at the same time, I was investigating software, and I found this software called Discourse, which is actually really well put together. I really liked that it had a very clean look to it. that it worked on mobile devices very well, and it had a moderation system which was focused around sort of trust and respect levels that you gained through participating in the community, but also which, if you, for instance, it's got a flagging system, and if you flag someone's post and the moderators decide that you flagged them because you were pissed off and you don't like that person or whatever, then, you actually get your own trust taken away. There's actually checks and balances in place for a lot of things, which I appreciated, that dynamic play of managing trust in the community from a software side while still having a human element. And so we spent a lot of time in a private area of the forum messing around with the software, creating fake topics, figuring out how things worked, and writing a code of conduct, which we all agreed was, set the right tone, made it very clear what we were all about, and specifically laying out what we thought was acceptable and wasn't acceptable in this forum, and launched it. I didn't really tell anybody. I mean, I wanted it to be. I didn't want to be like, on the one hand, yes, this was in response to something that happened on Pinside, but I didn't want to be like the anti-Pinside, because it was, while the straw that broke the camel's back was that thread that I saw Bowen in, it was something that had been germinating in my mind, seeing what had happened on league sites, on Facebook, all over the place in the pinball world for a long time. And so I kind of launched it, and I sent out some mail to people saying, hey, this is a thing I'm doing. If you're interested in it, come and participate. And it's just sort of been spreading by word of mouth since then. And it's actually grown into something that's pretty lively. We have just north of 250 members now. And, I'm seeing, probably 15 to 20 new posts and topics a day. It's like gotten to the point now where every time I go and look at it, there's something new posted. A lot of people have given me feedback that it's really great to see something that's from a player's perspective, that something that's more friendly and inviting, and I haven't really gotten any blowback on it at all, which has been really satisfying.
Sure, I think that it's sort of become a place for. I'm trying not to compare to Pinside, because I love Pinside, and there's so much good about Pinside, and there are some folks that I think get carried away a little bit, and it becomes sort of their playground in a ways. And what I do like about what you've got going on at Tilt Forums is when a discussion does pop up, and whether it's rules about a game, or I think I was reading the discussion on super bands versus traditional rubbers, it's pretty pointed conversation about that. You don't seem to have the tangents and the side talk, and I think that is sort of welcome on, especially when it comes to sort of the competitive side and the playing side and things that pertain to those aspects. So I do appreciate it, and I think it's great to have both. Yeah,
I mean, I never want to. I don't want to crush Pinside into the dirt or anything. If there's a people where people enjoy communicating and talking and whatever, then that's fine. It just wasn't a place where I enjoyed communicating and talking, and I wanted to make a place that I wanted to be a part of.
Sure, yeah, I think there's nothing wrong with that, and I think that. I think it speaks actually to pinball as a whole for the fact that it's even possible here in 2015 that you could start up a kind of alternative to the main place and have 250 people there chatting and talking about and having an active community. Not even great. Just
one place. I mean, you've got the IFPA pinball group on Facebook and the club pinball group on Facebook. There must be like 50 pinball groups on Facebook. Like every local scene has their own pinball group and stuff like that. And there are local message boards that are only available to local people. And it's like it's really fascinating. I've observed a lot of times that as the pinball industry declined, the level of play and the amount of players who came to tournaments and stuff was increasing. And it was really weird, like how that happened. And now it seems like that is finally feeding back into the industry again. And now, Stern is finally growing and pulling themselves out, and Jersey Jack is starting, and these like homebrew companies are starting. And it's like, I never would have thought, even 10 years ago that we would be seeing a resurgence of, participation, and that we would be able to support 100 different pinball communities in the one. And it's been really great to be a part of. And this is one little more thing that I can do to make things, to make a place for people to hang out and enjoy talking about pinball. That's great.
We're running a little short on time here. I don't want to not touch on the Pinball Outreach Project because it's an important thing. I know that actually you I think thought I knew, but I didn't actually know that you and Nicole Reich were. Right. I don't want to throw words out there.
A couple.
There we go. Let you say it. I didn't realize that. I know Nicole is the executive director of the Pinball Archive Project, which has just done amazing stuff as far as bringing children into pinball and bringing some fun into some people's lives. So I think that's amazing. Anything you'd like to say, throw out there for the POP organization right now?
I think the biggest thing that has happened there recently is that POP recently opened a headquarters in Portland. It's actually a location where people can come and play. We've got 8 games there running now, as modern as Tron and all the way back to a Royal Flush and a Vet and a Volley EM. And while it's a location where people can play, we're also using it. For instance, we have hours every afternoon where kids can play for free, or kids 13 and under can play for free. And we're doing a lot of community outreach with the local community because it's in a neighborhood that's changing a lot. And I think we've had a lot of feedback from the local community, from parents that are really happy to see a kid-friendly location open up. And we're going to start expanding that. We're talking about maybe doing a kids league or maybe a parents' kids league, where they play together or something like that. We're talking about getting in touch with the local science museums and stuff like that, because there's a lot of science in pinball, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, physics, software, art, all of that stuff. And putting together some educational programs perhaps. And, there's a lot of good stuff on the horizon for POP, and a lot of that was fed from the fundraising that happened through the IFPA month of tournaments last year, and a lot of that came from the pinball community. And so, but at the same time, Nicole was thinking that, if she wants to expand POP and make it bigger, there's sort of a limit to what she can expect to do just within the pinball community. So this is sort of a chance to achieve multiple goals.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. Well, I mean, just please let Nicole know, open invitation to come on the show and chat about that in the future.
Sure, absolutely.
It's such a great thing to, this thing that we all love, pinball. We all love it. We dream about it. We think about it. We can't wait to play it. But to actually turn that into something that, could be such a positive sort of impactful thing on another group of people is pretty amazing. So that's awesome.
Thanks.
Greg, I want to thank you so much for coming on tonight. A lot of good stories. There's much more. We got to get together at one of these tournaments and chat in person and have you back definitely on the show. I look forward to it. I really thank you for coming on Coast to Coast Pinball tonight.
No, thanks for having me. I love talking pinball, so anytime you want to talk more, I'm more than happy to do it.
Had a very, very great time talking with Greg tonight. Hope you enjoyed that conversation. I owe you a news episode. It's coming. There's a lot going on. I will get there, I promise. 159 is right around the corner. Thank you very much for listening. We'll talk to you again soon.